This is the Liberal Europe podcast by ELF, bringing liberal ideas into the political debate, with Leszek Jazdzewski and Ricardo Silvestre.
Hello, welcome to Liberal Europe. My name is Leszek Jazdzewski, and today we're going to talk about the recent developments from the summits that took place in Washington, one with Trump versus Putin, another one, Trump, Zelensky, and some other European leaders. And I have a great host today to comment on those very recent developments. Piotr Buras, who is the head of ECFR Warsaw office and a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Piotr, welcome back to Liberal Europe.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I wanted to start with short sort of summary from how I see things and waiting how you might want to respond. Because on one hand, it seems, that's really the sort of history moved fast forward in some ways in a very unexpected fashion. I think really what accelerated those was this arrival of Putin to Anchorage, quite surreal, I must say, in many ways. On one hand, it seems it's very hard to treat this seriously because Putin really gave away no ground, no concessions. Trump didn't seem to achieve anything from him, really. But on the other hand, what I think is important, and then we saw it from the meeting with Zelensky and European leaders, is that Trump is really like investing in the process. So he brought the Zelensky European leaders. And on Trump's side, what I think is very important is that he didn't exclude, and he even sort of flirted with some sort of American, if not guarantees, but some sort of arrangement in which US will be involved in the future security of Ukraine. And on the other hand, what I find quite striking, I must say, in a negative fashion, is how we moved from discussing withdrawal of Russia from the territory it invaded into whether or not Ukraine should give up the remaining parts of Donbas that it's holding on right now. So, Piotr, this is, and of course, there is a lot of compliments paid from European leaders to Trump. They were part of the meeting, but they will not be part of the future trilateral meeting if it happens. So, Piotr, I wanted to ask you how do you sort of analyze, how do you take it piece by piece, how seriously it is in your opinion, and what do you think might come out of this, if anything?
Yeah, thank you, Leszek. And of course, there's many angles to this discussion which we could use for the analysis. But I think, the way how I would perhaps look at all these developments is from the perspective of what would be necessary to make a real progress on the peace process. Because we focus for good reasons, of course, on the relations between the US and Ukraine, on how the Western alliance is trying to get its acts together and overcome some serious differences between the US and European partners on how to handle this process. But what is essentially I think the most important question here is what can bring us really forward, because we need to remember that Putin, and it has become clear also after yesterday's meeting, is not really interested in this process. I mean, he wants to play this game, but he's not really. He still is not ready, as it seems, to engage in serious peace negotiations. So I think there are three things which the West, the collective West, would have to come up with in order to make a real progress. And this is, I think, and I would probably start this analysis from going through these 3 points and see how far we have moved on the way to achieve them. So I think the first thing, which is, I think, absolutely necessary to make Putin engage in a serious peace process, is an increased pressure on Putin via credible threat of sanctions, or actually by imposing sanctions. And this is probably the most negative outcome of the recent events, that Trump in Anchorage basically gave up on the idea of imposing sanctions on Russia, despite the fact that Putin did not live up to Trump's expectations, which were, as he indicated clearly before the Anchorage summit, Putin would have to agree on a ceasefire and start peace negotiations afterwards. And Putin clearly rejected this claim. And despite that, Trump said there would be no sanctions, that he didn't see the need for any sanctions. And so I think on that, and this is a very important point, and this is also after yesterday's Washington summit, we still don't know whether Trump could change his mind, whether he can, whether he still wants or will want to use this leverage he could have on imposing secondary sanctions on Russia, basically hitting the oil sector by punishing those countries which still buy oil and gas from Russia. And this is the strongest leverage Trump could have on Putin, but he decided, so far, he has decided not to use it. And I have my doubt whether we can make any serious progress on the peace negotiations without increasing pressure on Putin, which is possible basically only via the American sanctions threatened before the Anchorage summit. So this is one point. So we don't know whether this important leverage will be used. The second, I think, important point, which or requirement for the West to bring Putin to the negotiating table and to make sure that this peace process can yield results, are security guarantees for Ukraine. And this is something which has been discussed for a very long time, and I have the feeling that some progress has been achieved. Yesterday, and this is the most, again, positive outcome of the last few days, is that the American president indicated that the United States would be ready to be somehow engaged in the process of securing peace, basically providing some security or some protection, good protection, and as Trump put it, to Ukraine. We still don't know what it is, what it might be, what it will involve. But this is, of course, an absolutely necessary step to be taken to make sure that Ukraine can be interested in any kind of peace settlement. Because without security guarantees, it is quite obvious that Ukraine will not be able to buy into this process. And the third requirement, which is needed, is Europe's readiness to shoulder a very significant burden of security support for Ukraine as soon as a peace agreement or ceasefire has been agreed upon, and to provide funding for Ukraine long term to make sure that Ukraine is able to buy weapons and to invest in its sound reconstruction. This seems to be the easiest part, because even if the European Union or European countries are in financial troubles, they do have enough money to support Ukraine. But still, I think there is a political kind of commitment or a general, readiness, but there is no clear plan. So we have money to finance Ukraine until the end of this year, but there are no concrete commitments by the European countries beyond the end of 2025. And this is something which needs to be worked on. And even if there are some security guarantees for Ukraine in case of a ceasefire or a peace agreement, it is obvious also after yesterday's summit that it will be the European Union, it will be European countries, which will have to contribute the largest share of the support for Ukraine, and this needs to be worked out. So I think this is where we are at the moment. So there is to sum up, this brief analysis. I think the weakest point after the summits in Anchorage and in Washington of the Western approach is that I think we don't have a collective agreement on how to increase pressure on Putin to engage in serious peace negotiations. The best news is that, as you said in your introduction, that the US seems to be more involved and more engaged into this process than it was before the summits, and more than the Europeans had maybe not expected but feared before, even a few weeks ago. So this is where we stand at the moment, I think.
Piotr, that was an excellent summary of I think main issues. That's the sort of key takeaways from those talks. What I was always sort of skeptical about any possibility of agreement because and perhaps it was perhaps the easiest at the very beginning when Ukraine was so terrified. I think it was ready to give up a lot just for securing its sovereignty. But once its sovereignty wasn't at stake, so once the Russia had to withdraw from Kiev, and the war was contained, let's say, of course, with many atrocities, but to mostly eastern and southern parts of Ukraine, it seemed very unlikely that Ukraine will be ready to give up what Russia wanted without a major failure on the front line. And fortunately, it didn't happen. But at the same time, Russia strategically hasn't been exhausted to the extent that I think a lot of people imagined at the very early stages of the war. The sanctions, of course, regime is tight and is important, but Russia can still manage to sell with the discount the oil and the gas to other countries, mainly China. The secondary sanctions are not introduced yet and they are discussed, but as you mentioned briefly, it's hard to imagine that it will be a lot in the arsenal of Trump that he's ready to punish Russia with. I think one of the key developments from this Anchorage summit was that Trump not just invested in a peace process, but also invested in Putin. And I thought it's actually quite extraordinary that Trump decided to, I mean, being a tough negotiator as he imagines himself to be, that he basically decided to give Putin what he wanted without really getting anything in exchange. Maybe he got his praise, but I think, in terms of negotiation, it's not much. So, but with all those things like at the back of our minds, still, I think what I find might be changing is that perhaps, but it's just a big question mark. I don't know. I wonder what you see. It's a bit like reading the future from the tea leaves, but you obviously have a lot of different sources and also your own analysis. So on one hand, we cannot perhaps exclude that even if just for the sake of pleasing Trump, Putin will be at least pretending he's trying to have a real negotiation. And it is a possibility. I don't say it's for sure, but it is a possibility that he might want to end hostilities for now, not just forever, but for now. and of course with something he can announce as a big victory. On the other hand, Zelensky obviously doesn't want to give up territory of Ukraine, but from his rhetoric, it seems that as long as the future security of Ukraine is provided, he understands that with the current situation, with Trump, who is basically cutting him off from any future support, he will be unable to regain those territories by force anytime soon. So fighting doesn't really make sense for Ukraine in terms of offensive, right? He can still be on the defensive, but he is really bleeding. His country is bleeding. He's really that Ukraine is losing the most as long as the war continues. So it's really up to Putin whether will he be content with Ukraine, which will be basically anti-Russian, sovereign, armed, and will be happy to get out of the isolation. So the price for Putin is to sort of be restored to international stage. Price for Ukraine is of course stop the war, but also a stop for any future Russian aggression if US and European guarantees are really meaningful. So I'm just wondering, for the first time, perhaps from the very beginning of this war, do you think that actually the peace is a possibility right now?
Yeah, of course, peace is a very relative notion because I think there are various readings of what this peace could be about, and as you said, I think Trump is probably interested mostly in in a very superficial definition of peace. So basically, the end of hostilities for now, which would allow him to claim huge negotiation success. And this is, of course, the biggest risk for Ukraine and for Europe, that in order to achieve this very superficial understanding or definition of peace, Trump would be able and willing to make very far-reaching compromises and even push the Ukrainians to perhaps give up parts of their territory or to agree on something they wouldn't otherwise want to agree. But after after the Washington summit, and I think we could be a little bit more optimistic that at least that was widely, feared in Europe, that this summit could have become a scene for this kind of breakthrough in this war, which would see Ukraine giving up to the American and Russian pressure. It seems that this threat has been fended off for now, and Trump did not go so far to expect from Zelensky this kind of concessions. There is the peace the Ukrainians are interested in is a lasting peace, is a peace which is secured for not just for a few weeks. It's not something which would equal a ceasefire or a cessation of hostilities for a limited period of time, but something which would make sure that Ukraine could recover as an independent country and that could survive long term as an independent state. Of course, that not solve the territorial issue, but I think indeed the realistic assumption is that it will be extremely difficult to gain back the territories which are now occupied by Russia. But what is mostly at stake for Ukraine is the survival of the country as an independent state. And here the territorial issue also comes in because the land swaps, so-called land swaps, which were floated by Trump in the recent days, they would probably, if they happened, they would change the strategic military situation to the detriment of Ukraine to such an extent that future Russian aggression would be even more likely and much easier to be done for Putin, because of the strategic importance of these parts of Donetsk Oblast, which Ukraine, under these land swaps, would be expected to cede to Russia. So I think, and that's why, from the Ukrainian perspective, the security guarantee issue is so important. So any peace, which is not, which basically means that the hostilities has stopped and the front line even has remained the same, but there is no long-lasting security support from the US, from the Western countries. There is no plan. There is no structure. That would be only an invitation for a further aggression by Russia. So that's why I think we are talking about various versions of peace. And for Putin, clearly he wants what is at stake for him is the return to the international community as a respected partner. And that could be indeed something which he could achieve thanks to Putin, thanks to Trump, if there was a big deal along the lines of Putin's expectations. So I think at the moment it's very difficult to predict which kind of peace is most likely to materialize. For the moment, still, I think there is very unlikely that any peace will be achieved in the next few months at least. But I think an important, still, I would claim that an important process has started, and it is a positive sign that the United States are deeper and deeper involved in this process. So because it is for Trump, it is with each summit at which he demonstrates his commitment and makes some declarations, it will be much more difficult to withdraw from this process and claim success. So I think the more he is engaged, the more he also represents the collective Western position, even superficially. I mean, there's no very precise common negotiating line by the West. But there are some points the leaders have agreed upon. I think it will be more difficult for Trump to abandon this process, and this is, of course, a positive sign.
So I wanted to ask you about this recent meeting with some of some of the European leaders. How much do you think Europe is really involved? To what extent it's more uh, a bystander or observer of something which is happening between Trump, Putin, Trump, Zelensky? At the same time, EU is not EU, but European countries, including Britain, well, I suppose to play some still yet undefined role securing Ukraine in the future. It's hard to tell whether there's gonna be troops on the ground. I cannot imagine that Putin really nodded to Witkov or Trump. I mean, considering like NATO, I mean, effectively NATO troops in Ukraine, it's but at the same time, even Macron was describing the future of those negotiations as trilateral without European involvement. It seems very weird, as we are as Europeans supposed to really take the burden of those guarantees with some support of US, but not really be part of this real negotiation, being again sidelined. Do you think it's a wrong impression, or do you think that perhaps those leaders didn't want to try to take the leading role, or do you think they couldn't take it? They can only be invited by Trump. They cannot act on their own. That we lack this European sovereignty on the issues concerning our security. How do you read the role of Europeans in this process?
The role of the Europeans is limited but important but it depends, of course, very much on Trump's strategy. As long as the United States wants really to have a lasting peace in Ukraine and a lasting solution, something which is not a hastily, arranged ceasefire claimed big peace deal. Europe is important, has its leverage, and can play its cards in an effective way, I think. If, but of course, the European countries, and this is the sad truth, and that's why their role is limited, are not in a position to impose their will and their positions on their own without cooperation with the US, because this leverage is too little. I mean, because it is obvious that if the Americans withdraw from this conflict, I mean, stop their support for Ukraine, if they're denied to impose sanctions on Russia, and even don't want to use this leverage, the threat of sanctions, then the strategic situation of Ukraine and of Europe is completely different. So I think the opportunity the Europeans are facing now is that perhaps Trump is becoming more and more involved in the lasting solution, or at least a search for a lasting solution for this conflict. And Europeans are a necessary partner for him to achieve this goal. And this is mainly about security guarantees and money. And these are the two big contributions the Europeans can and have to make in order to achieve progress and achieve a peace deal. Because without them and without these two contributions, it will be very, very unlikely that they will be able to have an imprint on in which direction it goes. But the fact is that so there is a coalition of countries which work on a European contribution to the security guarantees for Ukraine. And of course, we still have the financial means with which we can support Ukraine long term. Also, for example, in purchasing American weapons for Ukraine. And there is a Financial Times published a report claiming that the Ukrainians offered to buy weapons from the American partners at a value of $100 billion to be financed by the Europeans. So certainly there are talks going on also about that, and this is the leverage that the Europeans can have.
Piotr, thank you. It's been very important that we take the pulse of what's really happening and that we understand deeply those processes, and also the role that Europeans, maybe a supporting act, but you can even get an Oscar for the supporting act. So it could be that important, and I think actually essential with such pragmatic person as Donald Trump, that there is money involved and investment, and not giveaways and presents, and Europeans can certainly provide some muscle in terms of financing. Piotr Buras, thank you so much for joining us at Liberal Europe today.
Thank you, Leszek.
So that's all for today. From me, please tune in for Ricardo Silvestre next week. Until 2 weeks. Goodbye.
You were listening to the Liberal Europe podcast by the European Liberal Forum.